Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, the NLCS is all tied up 1-1 and heading back to Citi Field. We break down the offense coming to life, Sean Manaea being an ace when needed most, and how things are set up going forward. We also touch on Francisco Lindor not being a Gold Glove finalist. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today and subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. If you'd like to drop us a review, drop us a mailbag question with that review. You could also watch us on YouTube and ask mailbag questions in the comments under the show there as well. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo, as the NLCS rolls on. And things are all tied up, Joe, 1-1. The Mets do what you have to do when you are the road team to open a playoff series like this. Can you steal one on the road, get back home field advantage? And also, most importantly, Joe, get a little momentum. If they won the first game and lost the second game, I don't think it would change too much in the series, but it feels like everything swung back the Mets' way as the offense woke up against the Dodgers bullpen game. We are going to recap the first two games. Then, of course, we'll look ahead to the games played at Citi Field. But, Joe, it was a dud of a first game and then a bit of a thriller in the second game, despite the Mets getting out to a 6-0 lead early.
Game one, this is going to be much more of a positive podcast. As you mentioned, 1-1, exactly what the Mets had to do in Los Angeles. And we talk about this throughout the year. Sometimes just the order of victories when it comes to when we're recording this podcast sets the tone. Like if the Mets won game one the way they won game two and lost game two the way they lost game one, might be a bit of a different feel here. But one thing I want to say for game one, and Connor, I actually want to ask you here, because it obviously ended up being a hot button topic because of how the results went. Did you have an issue going into the series with the Mets' plans to start Kodai Senga game one?
So, Joe, I spun myself really into a pretzel with this one, and I'll take you through the timeline. Going into it, I had no problem at all. Like, I want to be fully clear here. I didn't want to be the hindsight guy. And then when people started to kind of throw out different things they could have done, of course, after Senga really struggled in the start, I was like, yeah, that makes some sense. Maybe this was a risk that wasn't worth taking. And then when I collected myself entirely the next day, I looked at it and said, and you know me, Joe, I'm not always the most optimistic or pessimistic Mets fan. I think I lie somewhere in the middle. I felt really good going into that Monday game because then I looked at it and said, okay, Sean Manaea game two against the Dodgers bullpen game. Everybody's talking about the Dodgers bullpen game against the Padres. I think the Mets are going to come out ready. They got their guy on the mound. It was a risk with where Senga is at in the season, but I didn't think it was egregious. So I went full circle with it, and I'd be lying here if I told you going into that game I said it would be the wrong move.
Right. And I felt the same way. Going into the game, everything was lined up. And when I want to line up a playoff series like this, as much as you can't guarantee a game 6 or 7, you kind of really want to have your best horses ready for those games. And the Mets splitting in LA kind of made it, in a sense, all worth it. So now if this series goes to 6, Sean Manaea is starting game 6. If this series goes to 7, Luis Severino is going to be set up for game 7. And that's about as best as you could set up the pitching staff for a series like this. It'll be very interesting to see how they approach game 5. And I wonder if the results over the next 2 games have a bearing on that. Like if the Mets win game 3 and 4 and they go up 3-1, are they more willing to take the risk with Senga? Whereas if they split or they lose, maybe you trot David Peterson out as the starter. Yeah. I think the argument on the Senga side of things is either you wanted him on the roster or not at all. Because if you weren't going to start him game 1, were you going to start him game 2 and then he's lined up for game 6? It was obviously a hot button topic. I didn't have an issue with the way the Mets handled it. My issue ultimately was that Kodai Senga threw very few more strikes than you or I would have if we were on the mound. He just didn't have it, couldn't find the strike zone. The velocity was down, and it was down from even what was in Philadelphia. He popped a couple 96s and 97s in Philadelphia. In LA, it was 92, it was 93. I might have seen a 94 like mixed in there. Just didn't seem right. And at the end of the day, Jack Flaherty shut the Mets offense down, and kind of whoever pitched, I guess it really wouldn't have made too big a difference if Flaherty was going to pitch that way. The one negative, I guess you would say, from that outing with Flaherty dominating the way he did, the Mets didn't get into the Dodgers bullpen the way you would have wanted to. Knowing a bullpen game was coming in game 2, you really were hoping to get Flaherty out after 5 or 4 or 5 innings, so that way you get more relievers in to that game. But alas, didn't work out, and now we move on to game 2, where things took a quick positive turn in the Mets' favor.
That's the thing, Joe. The team responded, and it's funny. After game 1, it felt like naturally everybody's going to run through a million different scenarios and why the Mets did it wrong. Then you kind of throw out what actually happened after the 2 games. And if you're a Mets fan, I think you'd sign up for it 100 out of 100 times, because you got your win on the road. The offense woke up. You responded to adversity for the 100th time this season. Like, at some point, people just need to. It was so funny after they got blown out by the Dodgers. And that's what's amazing about baseball playoffs comparison to obviously something like football, where one game is one game. You could lose 30-0 and it could have no carryover to the next game. And for this Mets team, it never has a carryover. They just start fresh. They looked ready to roll. They were aggressive early, but they also took amazing at-bats where they showed patience when they needed to. Obviously, who gets them started? Francisco Lindor, as he always does. Who has the moment? Mark Vientos, who is truly turning into a star for this franchise right now. I think when you look at it, there are different ways to, talk about the scenarios of that game 1. But the Mets, at the same time, Joe, look at it like this, right? To throw a little counterpoint. Say they started Manaea, and say the offense did nothing like they did in that game, and the Mets lose 2 or 3-0, right? And then Manaea's burnt, and then you're facing that Senga-Peterson situation in game 2 against the bullpen, and that game could have been closer, or could have been another loss. So it felt like the Mets used their ace against a bullpen game, and they got the one win that they needed to have, and it worked out. And we'll kind of stick to that game 2 here, Joe. God, there's so much to take away from this one, but a lot of the action happened early. I thought the most underrated part of the game, and this is something the Mets have gotten really good at in recent weeks, when the bullpen starts to take some dents, right? It feels like, oh man, the other team is believing again. They're chipping away. They're getting a lot of opportunities. The bullpen is walking way too many people. The Mets have been able to scratch out an insurance run late in the game. And I know people will say, well, Connor, why does that matter? They won 7-3 anyway, because it takes life out of the other side. You start playing differently. You start thinking, okay, we got to get multiple guys on base this inning just to have the tying run at the plate at some point, rather than, hey, we're going to try to scratch out a couple runs here. So, and shout out to Pete Alonso, stealing second base and then scoring all the way from second to home, where he was running for his life there, Joe. That it's an underrated quality of this team right now, finding the insurance run that, in my opinion, is a gut punch to the opposite dugout.
And a player that has found himself in those positions routinely this postseason, Starling Marte, this feels like the 2022 Starling Marte, making hard contact, spraying mainly line drives up the middle, the other way. He even pulled one down the line. Starling Marte is moving him to the 5th spot in the order, which Carlos Mendoza could have easily just kept riding the same exact lineup that he issued, every day throughout this postseason. And, it's not a significant change, but Marte being in that spot instead of Jose Iglesias, which I think we need to have a conversation about Jose Iglesias, but having Marte in that spot allowed that insurance run to occur. And just, it was great to see, because when you look at Edwin Diaz, and at this point, I think it's fair to say nobody really trusts Edwin Diaz right now. He's all over the place. Control comes and goes. It feels like now he puts a couple guys on, and then he just kind of like a light bulb goes off in his head, like, oh, wait, now's the time to throw strikes. And then he attacks, and things are a lot better. The reality is he's the best reliever they have, and they're going to go where Edwin Diaz takes them at the end of games. So any extra runs that you could get is better, like you said, for the kind of psyche of your opponent, but also for maybe the comfort of mind for Edwin Diaz.
Yeah, that's the issue, right? Like the Mets, and Mendoza's aware of this. They need him to get a championship. It comes down to that. They will not win a World Series by babying Edwin Diaz, right? They're just not. They're not going to win a World Series if it's like, okay, Edwin doesn't look confident. We're going to use him in the 6th and 7th inning instead here. And then we're going to just kind of figure this out in the 9th inning. They need their $100 million closer to slam the door on games. That's what it comes down to right now. So,
and ultimately, Connor, he is.
Yeah.
It's not fun. It is high anxiety.
It's a rocky road.
It is high stress, but he is shutting the door, and that is the job. Would I love it so much if that 9th inning was just strike 1, strike 2, strike 3 to 3 straight batters? I sure would. But I think some people are confusing like the anxiety and stress of it with, a bigger quote unquote problem.
He takes the no tolls route, Joe. It's like, all right, I'm going to walk the first 2 batters. Everyone's terrified. I look like I have no idea where the ball is going. And then I'm going to pinpoint corners against some of the best hitters in baseball. So at the end of the day, the results are the results, and Edwin Diaz got them. So you brought this up right now with Iglesias. I think it's, we're going to get deeper into game 3 and game 4, but I think to have the Iglesias conversation, you do need to kind of talk about with what's happened. To me, Joe, and it's frustrating, right? Because Iglesias has been one of the best stories of this team. He's really great defensively at second base and has a blunder in the playoffs that you wouldn't expect. He is getting up there and just looking to make something happen. And he's kind of just lost what made him such a great hitter for the Mets throughout the long course of the season. I know it's the simplest baseball conversation, but this is the case when you just watch Jose Iglesias. He is just overreacting to everything, and the urgency is at a place where it doesn't need to be. I felt like Jesse Winker was like this when he got to the Mets. Winker was so good at getting on base all year. He got to the Mets, and he wanted to make things happen, and he lost that, and then he refound it again later in the season. It's been a tough go of it for Iglesias, Joe.
The OMG remix is already number 1 on the charts. You don't need to be a postseason hero to sell more copies of OMG. But jokes aside, it's something the Mets have to look at. With Jeff McNeil now on the roster, and yes, he has missed time. He hasn't played much. I totally understand. I had a back and forth on Twitter, a little unexpectedly, with former Met Paul LaDuca last night to talk about Iglesias, kind of out of nowhere. It's a tough balance of wanting to use what got you here, because the Mets are not in this position if they don't have Jose Iglesias. There's no denying that. But you also have to look at the data and the information that you have right now. And that information that I have is Jose Iglesias has almost taken almost 0 good at bats this postseason. He's gotten a few hits, so it's not like it's all bad. He is swinging at everything. And part of the quality of Iglesias during the season was how many 8-pitch at-bats did he work, 9-pitch at-bats. He was battling. He would take walks. It feels like the only way Iglesias is not going to swing at a pitch is if it almost hits him. So I think he is maybe trying a little too hard, whereas his approach and the type of player that Jose Iglesias is fine to be that. He doesn't need to be anything else. And I know when we look ahead, and we'll get into the Citi Field games, but looking ahead, he is 4 for 10 in his career against Walker Buehler, the slated Game 3 starter for the Dodgers. So you might give Iglesias another day, but if he doesn't have improved at bats, and results are always pending, but if he doesn't have the quality of at bat that I'm used to, I'm putting Jeff McNeil in the lineup for game 4, and I may even, pinch hit with him at some point in the game. But it's just a discussion I think that needs to be had. And, it's not anything against Iglesias. The Mets just need to win baseball games and get to the World Series. And he has not been a major factor offensively in them getting there.
Here's the funny part, Joe. You want to talk about numbers and why this is such a difficult, decision if there is one to be made. You bring up Iglesias, right? 4 for 10 against Walker Buehler. Jeff McNeil, 1 for 9 against Walker Buehler. But this is not, as the saying goes, your father's Walker Buehler right now. Walker Buehler this year against lefties is giving up an almost 900 OPS. He's borderline unpitchable against lefties. Now, what I'll say is to your point of, because I think when you have the pulse of the clubhouse like Mendoza does, you want to be really careful with this situation. Yeah. The other side of it, Joe, is assuming Yamamoto is the game 4 starter, Yamamoto doesn't allow anything to lefties. So it doesn't feel like that might be a great situation to dump McNeil back into with the starter on the mound that allows literally nothing to lefties, where Walker Buehler's getting lit up by lefties. But like you said, Joe, you also don't want to be too reactionary. My honest plan would be to give McNeil the start against Buehler and see if he can really get one on Buehler, who just has no answer for left-handers right now. I'd put Iglesias in the game as soon as they go to the bullpen, assuming it doesn't matter if it's a righty or a lefty. And then I would probably ride it out with Iglesias against Yamamoto and see if that little rest gave him a little time to sit back and watch playoff baseball and clear his head. But there's just no denying this. Anyone that tells you this is what to do, this is what not to do, it's a really tough scenario for a manager that has had a lot of the answers this year, by the way.
Yeah, he, whatever the buttons he's pressing, I'm going to trust what Carlos Mendoza thinks. And, when you go back to that players meeting that the Mets had way back in May, when everything turned around, one of the major things from that meeting was everyone taking accountability. And I think if Mendoza makes the decision to put Jeff McNeil in the lineup, whether that's game 3 or game 4, great stats that you brought up. Didn't think about the Yamamoto portion. I was just like, Iglesias doing well against...
It's reverse splits, by the way. Yamamoto is a righty that I think he allows a sub 600 OPS to lefties, but he's vulnerable against the right-handed bat.
Yeah, so that ultimately, maybe it makes sense to do McNeil game 3 and Iglesias game 4. I trust that the locker room will know that Mendoza is doing what he thinks is the best opportunity for the Mets to win that given day. I could be wrong, but I don't think there's going to be outrage in the locker room if Jeff McNeil starts over Jose Iglesias for a day. I could be wrong, but I have doubts about that.
I think this team's just too locked in, Joe.
Yeah, they're too locked in, and it's just at the point where this is a conversation that has to happen. As good as game 2 was and as happy as we are today, getting out of LA with that split that they had to have, it doesn't mean there isn't room or potential for more. And if you throw Jeff McNeil out there, who knows? He might get a couple hits. He had his one pinch hit appearance, and he ripped a line drive kind of right up the middle. It was caught, but I think Jeff McNeil gives you a shot, and you could always bring Iglesias in for defense. You could always pinch hit him against a left-hander. So it certainly isn't me saying, the bloom is off the rose and Jose Iglesias is done. It's just, let's do what may be the best to help the Mets win game 3.
You're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's continue the look ahead at this series, Joe. The next 3 games at Citi Field, the place is going to be rocking. I mean, the fall weather in the air, a packed house for these evening games. I like the way things are set up for the Mets right now. I really do. And I will get to the Yamamoto game in a second. We touched on Buehler. It feels like, and Smoltz has been on this on the most of the broadcasts, the Mets want to win on the back of their starter, giving them as much length to the bullpen as possible. The Dodgers are a team that feels like if they have to pull the plug on the starter early and go to their bullpen, they think their bullpen can keep them in any game, especially with the offense they have. How do you see that for game 3 where, let's be real, as Mets fans, NLCS at Citi Field, Walker Buehler on the mound, you want to see the Mets come out and score 5 runs in the first 4 innings of this game.
You got to come out of the gates hot, much like they did in game 2. I think that's the recipe here. With the Citi Field crowd behind them, Severino, don't give up any runs in the first inning. Just get out of the first inning with a 0. And if the Mets can tack on a run or 2 against Walker Buehler in the first inning, I think that would really set the stage for what the rest of that game can look like. And I do agree with Smoltz when it comes to just the way the teams are set up. The Mets are set up based on their starting pitching. We could talk about the relievers. I know Phil Maton has had his ups and downs. Things might have been a touch different if the double play that Iglesias let go through his legs. Manaea was on the mound, but Maton was certainly about to come in. So things could have been different if that worked out the way it did. But right now, the trust tree of relievers for the Mets, it isn't that long for the relievers. You almost wonder, is Jose Butto in that trust tree? I personally questioned game 1. Why is Jose Butto pitching when they're down 100 in the 8th inning? But ultimately, it's Diaz, it's Stanek, it's Maton, it's Reed Garrett, it's maybe Jose Butto. And the reality is, you would love to say the name David Peterson, but at this point, you can't use David Peterson in game 3 or game 4 because he very well may need to be the starter in game 5, depending on how the Mets want to attack that. So they need Luis Severino to find a way to pitch into the 6th inning. He needs to pitch, at minimum 5. But if you could get 6 innings out of Severino, I think that gives you a real fighting chance against a guy in Walker Buehler who, to your point, Connor, this isn't the Walker Buehler, that we've known. 2 Tommy John surgeries. He's been through it. The stuff hasn't quite bounced back. Velocity is getting better and better as the season has worn on, but the stuff just still isn't quite there for Buehler. The Mets need to jump on him.
Yeah, and it's been a very uneven, 6 weeks here for Buehler right now. You go back to his last start against the Padres, he gives up 6 runs in 5 innings. Before that, he went 4 against the Padres with 1 run. And then before that, against the Rockies, it was, 5 1/3 innings, 4-run ball. Before that, against the Braves, 6 innings of 1-run ball, or 2 runs, 1 earned. And then before that, against the Cubs, 5 innings of 5 runs. Like, every other start is an adventure for Walker Buehler. What I'll say is, and why I don't think he's due for one of his good starts in this every other situation, is the Mets have capitalized in these situations and they know what's at stake. And there is something to feeding off your crowd. I think this Mets team, they are really enjoying the moment right now. They have a lot of guys that, it's so interesting, Joe. It feels like 2022, they got swallowed up by the moment, and they dealt with some bad luck and injuries, but they also got swallowed up by the moment. This team is the exact opposite in a sense that they're just feeding off of whether it's their backs against the wall or the lights are the brightest. And it's Lindor deserves, obviously being the story because he is. But how about Mark Vientos right now? I mean, Mark Vientos is having a postseason that is out of sight right now. And you brought up Marte having really good at-bats, Winker making things happen. I'll say this right now, Joe. If the Mets get anything out of Francisco Alvarez the rest of this series, they will not lose this series. If they get anything out of Francisco Alvarez offensively, they will not lose this series. And I think that's why Mendoza is sticking with him. He's hoping that the young kid can kind of feed off of the home crowd bright lights and see if he has one in him.
Also, Pete Alonso, fantastic at bats this postseason.
Yes,
and throughout the season, we've talked about all the, chasing and all the problems that Pete has had. He's worked great at bat after great at bat. And when it comes to Alvarez, obviously, it's the overswinging. He is trying to hit every ball 450 feet. You just need him to connect on one of them and hit it 450 feet, and it could just change the whole spectrum of this series. let's talk Mark Vientos. Michael Jordan meme Vientos, as I'd like to call him. I cannot believe that Dave Roberts intentionally walked Francisco Lindor in the third inning of a game to get to Mark Vientos with the way Mark Vientos is hitting the ball right now, this postseason, heck, during the season. I know Lindor hit a home run in the first, and they certainly are thinking about that. Yeah, don't just put the bat in Mark Vientos' hands. He is showing that he is a big-time player. We've talked about it on this show when it comes to Lindor and it comes to Alonso. Big-time players step up in the big-time moments. Well, Mark Vientos is establishing himself right now as a big-time player that steps up in the big moments, and just all the credit in the world to him. We talked on this show in June of 2022. Call up Mark Vientos, give him a run at designated hitter, and let's see if we can avoid giving up prospects at the deadline for designated hitters. They didn't give him a chance. They traded for Daniel Vogelback and Darren Ruff. 2023. Let's give Mark Vientos a chance. He had a couple spurts where he would come up. He'd play once a week, maybe, sat on the bench, didn't get an opportunity. This past offseason, give Mark Vientos a chance at DH. It is open. Just do it. He has a perfectly fine spring. They signed JD Martinez, which neither of us had it. We were happy that they signed JD Martinez, but that meant yet another time where Mark Vientos was not going to get a chance here, and he got sent back down to AAA. They called him up for a day. I think someone was on paternity leave or something. He hits a walk-off home run, and they go, "Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Enjoy the trip back to Syracuse." Back to Syracuse he goes. He finally gets the call up in May, and Brett Beatty obviously wasn't working out. And this is a guy that went through a lot over the last 3 years where he had to have questioned in his head multiple times, does this team even believe I have any chance to play at the major league level? And he has taken the opportunity and he has run with it. And he has gone from a guy the Mets have incessantly tried to replace to a cornerstone, part of the core, whatever word you want to use. Mark Vientos has established himself, and this postseason is just heightening his allure within the confines of the game, not just among Met fans now.
Well said. It's one of the better examples of, a young player in New York handling adversity as well as you could possibly handle it. It was I remember, and this isn't to single anyone out, I remember who asked it. I literally remember us getting a mailbag question, Joe, after they signed JD Martinez. It was probably the show after the emergency reaction to signing him. And the question was like, hey, if we're not going to give this kid a chance, just let him go somewhere else. And we sat here and we were like, you don't just trade young talent for the sake of trading young talent because they're blocked by someone, because there are so many injuries in this league and you never know what they're going to do with a new opportunity. And Vientos is the perfect case of he got an opportunity. He kept his head down. He always produced in AAA Syracuse. And when he came up with this regime, he completely owned the moment. And he's turned into, dare I say, he's close to the Mets' best pure hitter. And that's a convoluted description because obviously Francisco Lindor is here, number one. So maybe he's number two. But Pete is a true power guy now. Pete isn't rookie Pete anymore, where you think he's going to hit 280, and Pete's a great power hitter. And I think his approach this playoffs has been phenomenal, like you alluded to earlier, Joe. But the last two full seasons is what I'm saying. Yeah. Vientos is a guy that can hit 280, hit 30 home runs, get on base at a really good clip. It's just the approach is remarkable for a slugger, but it's almost disrespectful to call Vientos a slugger because he's such a good pure hitter, Joe.
And he's gotten better and better and better. It wasn't long ago on this show, we went over his splits month by month, like his OPS and how consistent of a player he is. But when you watch day in and day out, you could get Mark Vientos with the breaking ball down and away. And at times this postseason, that has happened as well. but you're seeing him mature, and he's laying off just a couple more of them where he might have chased that last month, but he didn't chase it this month. So it's just been incremental growth at his approach and his strength. The grand slam that he hit, I didn't think off the bat that was leaving the ballpark. I saw the pitcher's reaction, which made me think maybe it will. And I saw Andy Pages, the center fielder for the Dodgers, kind of slowing up near the track. I was like, it's just going to die in the first couple feet of the warning track, and he's going to catch it. It'll be a close call. But he stopped because it was just gone, and there was nothing he could do about it. Such a strong kid, and his ability to take the ball the other way, which is really his natural power, going back to when the Mets drafted him and started developing him. He naturally went the other way. He had to develop that pull power, and he has that too. If you throw a pitch inside, Mark Vientos will turn around and smack that ball to the left. So he's an all fields hitter, improved approach, legitimate, as you said, potential 30 home run type of stick that is going to be in the middle of the Mets order, I think, for some time.
Yeah, I think so too. So game 4, Joe, we're safe to assume this is Quintana against Yamamoto?
I would think so.
It lines up that way. Yeah. If the Dodgers don't pitch Yamamoto in this game, something is severely wrong, by the way. So I know they really didn't have a choice, but I'm going to be honest, Joe. I am fascinated to watch Yamamoto in this setting, especially if the Mets win on Wednesday, game 1. This is going to be as high pressure situation. And Yamamoto's a young player too. Let's not forget, he's not, when Senga came over here, he was a veteran. He pitched in Japan for a long time. Yamamoto is still a young player. It's been a up and down rookie season for him here in America. There's been a lot of good. There's also been some injury. I know over the last 5 starts, he's averaging about 4 innings per start. There's 2 3-inning starts in there. He's had some rough appearances. He's had some good ones. That is going to be a true test, Joe, of, what kind of temperament you have, because that is just being thrown into the cauldron.
I'll give him this. He pitched fantastic in game 5 against the Padres.
When they needed him most.
When they needed him most, he stepped up in a meaningful way. And it's just a fun dichotomy, because we spent how many months on this show talking about the Mets and Yoshinobu Yamamoto. And it wasn't until, honestly, a couple days before he signed with the Dodgers that, I still thought he was ending up with the Mets. I was like, the Mets are just going to give him the highest offer, and he's going to take the most money. And it turns out he wanted to be in LA, and he wasn't going to just keep upping it. He wanted to get ahead of Garrett Cole's money, which he did. And he wanted to be in LA, which he did. So all the, I guess, credit and good for him to get what he wanted. But this is going to be a huge spot, like you said, especially if the Mets win Wednesday's game. Yamamoto is going to have so much pressure. And Jose Quintana on the Mets side has pitched both of the clinching games for the Mets. So this is very different. Very different pitchers, right? Yamamoto's coming at you with the power stuff and the yo-yo curve and the split, everything he's got. Jose Quintana's like, I'm coming at you with 90 and changeups and curveballs, and I'm going to try to paint the box that you see on the screen. He's just like, all those lines, I'm trying to hit every single one of them. And he has shown the propensity to get himself out of trouble. He'll put a couple guys on. He'll get himself out of trouble. Jose Quintana is a pro's pro that I think is more than ready for this moment. And you have him start game 4. And if the series continues on to 6 or 7, Jose Quintana could be a relief factor probably at the end of the series if you need him to be. But I think from a pitching standpoint, and ultimately we'll see how it all goes, I think the Mets have this set up almost exactly the way you would like it to be.
I'm with you. It's exciting. You got to feel really good about this heading back to Citi, tied up right now, and the way the pitching is set up as well for the Mets. Let's see if they can 3 more wins and they're in the World Series. That's all it comes down to, is 3 more wins and they are in the World Series, which we're not going to be the show to lay out Subway Series scenarios for you. I think it's just wild that people are getting that far ahead of their skis, but we'd all love it if that time
We'll be
comes.
ready. I'll be ready for it.
We're not going anywhere. We sat here and talked about Jonathan Ruse for a month last year, and now we're talking about the Mets 3 wins away from the World Series. Before we get out of here, Joe, this is kind of a hot button topic today, and I've never been so unbothered by something that is admittedly so egregious. Francisco Lindor is not a Gold Glove finalist. I'm just at the point with Lindor where I'm remembering all of these things because there's going to be a day many, many years from now where people are talking about Francisco Lindor being Hall of Fame ballot eligible. And there's going to be a lot of people that are so addicted to accolades and stats when it comes to Hall of Fame voting, which I think is a horrific process, by the way. I'll just mention that to begin with. And I'm remembering all of these things because Francisco Lindor is robbed consistently as an all-star candidate. He is now robbed as a Gold Glove finalist. And I want nothing more than Lindor to just hold the World Series trophy at the end of this year and say, you know what mattered the most in all of this is that I got us this rather than the individual accolades. And I think that matters the most to Lindor because he's such a team player, Joe. I do think it is a shame because us as Mets fans will appreciate him as a all-star in our minds, Gold Glover in our minds. But the reason this is problematic and really just a sham is that there's will be something that factors into his legacy from an accolades on paper portfolio for non-New York media people.
You're absolutely right that I think Francisco Lindor would trade all of these personal accolades for the right to hold up that World Series trophy as a New York Met. I genuinely believe he is team first in every sense of the word. But that's exactly it. And that's what bothers me, Connor. It's not, okay, whatever. If Francisco Lindor is an all-star, whatever. I don't know how you don't make him an all-star. I get he wasn't good until, near the middle of May. But there are certainly worse players that get named all-stars than Francisco
Orlando
Lindor
Arcia
does.
being number one.
Orlando Arcia, you know what? Give him the Silver Slugger while we're at it. I assume he had a good enough year to be the shortstop Silver Slugger. For a while, I used to say the Gold Glove, while a defensive award, also had offense attached to it. Like, they're not giving the Gold Gloves to guys that don't hit at all. So I was like, Lindor hit enough to even be a Gold Glove Award finalist, 98th percentile and outs above average, plus 16. I wouldn't care if he lost it again to Dansby Swanson. If he did, so be it. Swanson is an unbelievable defensive shortstop, and, he won the Gold Glove last year. He would be deserving. The fact that Francisco Lindor can't be in the top 3 is beyond me. There's no metric that says he shouldn't be, and if you watch baseball, so
watch the game,
whether you're analytically driven or you're the other side where you couldn't care less what the numbers say, you say, I watched the game. How can you watch the game and say Francisco Lindor is not one of the best defensive players in the sport? Forget one of the best defensive shortstops just anywhere. So it sucks when you think ahead because Lindor is on that trajectory. If he stays healthy and he keeps the pace that he's going, Francisco Lindor is going to be very much in the Hall of Fame discussion. And to your point, Connor, when it comes to the national baseball writers, they will cite all-star appearances. They will cite MVP awards. They will cite Gold Gloves and Silver Sluggers and all these accolades. And every time that Lindor gets kind of shortchanged, that could have a lasting impact down the road. But to me, it's sad that this guy doesn't get that type of recognition too. While he wants to win, I'm sure he would love the satisfaction of being handed a Rawlings Gold Glove at Citi Field next spring. I'm sure he would have loved to have been the MVP. Like, that obviously is not going to work out. But the lack of personal accolades has a potential lasting effect. While right today, it's just kind of like, oh, this is really stupid. We might be thinking of it differently when we're doing the Mets pod in 15 years.
Spot on, Joe. That was the first thing that came to mind for me. And, it's funny when you brought up your face when you said he would have liked to be the MVP, but obviously Ohtani has a historic offensive season. I'll close on this. I had a little bit of a laugh when the Mets threw Ohtani out, stealing second the other day, and seeing all that dirt on his jersey. And I just thought about how little Ohtani plays throughout the course of a baseball game. And it just listen, Ohtani is offensively brilliant. There's no other way around it. It's the power.
One of the best we've ever seen.
One of the best we've ever seen. Maybe one day he will be a, big time presence on the mound again. But it's just remarkable when you look at the wear and tear and the physical taxing it takes on not only playing the field, but playing shortstop. When I saw him slide, he almost was overwhelmed by that tag and the impact of the play. And I'm like, man, Ohtani just doesn't have a lot of bang, bang, 100-mile-an-hour moments in the sport like this because he doesn't play the field. And he's usually a gifted enough runner that doesn't get thrown out. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just being a little bit of a jerk as a Mets fan, but it just came to mind right away what Lindor is doing compared to what Ohtani did. I still think there's a conversation there that won't be had anymore, but you can't emphasize enough the Mets winning this series kind of puts all of those individual things to the side.
Puts them to the side. Let's win 3 more games. Let's have another podcast previewing the World Series. I'm very ready for it. So let's bring that along. And we can't go through this pod without doing more than a mention for Sean Manaea. The way he showed up in game 2 and the way he handled Shohei Ohtani. Ohtani did not see the baseball out of Manaea's hands once. He was befuddled the whole day. And, just the way Manaea handled the top of that order with Mookie Betts, with Teoscar Hernandez and Freddie Freeman, he gave the Mets exactly what they needed. And I think it's at the point now where Manaea is great for 5. You really have to start paying attention around the 6th inning. They had a stat on Fox last night about his stats for the first 5 innings and then 6 and beyond. They take a huge dip down, but Manaea has been every single thing that the Mets could have possibly asked for, and his ability to step up in that game, in that moment where, look, this podcast would have had a heck of a different feel if Sean Manaea gave up 4 runs and the Mets are down 2-0 to the Dodgers going to Citi Field. Mets don't get here without Sean Manaea, and they certainly aren't 1-1 in this series without him.
No, he's been incredible. It's how he's reinvented himself, his presence with this team. When you hear the guy talk, he is everything you dream of, in terms of being the front line. This rotation didn't have somebody expected to handle that role when Senga wasn't pitching this year. And Manaea has taken it on full head of steam where he goes out there and you just feel so good about what he's going to be able to give you. And I think the Mets truly feel it with his starts is what I'm starting to notice. The Mets go out there, they're more loose at the plate, they're more loose in the field. They just know when Manaea's on the mound,
he's going to give them a chance.
They have a great chance of winning. They don't feel like not everybody's going up there and trying to hit a home run on the first 2 pitches and finding themselves buried in a 0-2 count because they know they can work through the game and find a way to scratch out wins because of how steady his, have a presence he is. And yeah, to back up some of your points there, Joe, with him through the order at just by inning, 6th inning, a 4.15 ERA, 7th inning, a 4.91 ERA. He's nearly untouchable, it feels like, before that. But that's why they're a little bit more careful with him. Although now all the chips are on the table for the Mets here. So I think when
and hey, right, look, Sean Manaea has thrown more innings this season than he ever has before. Luis Severino has thrown almost as many innings this year as he did in 2019 through 2023 combined. The Mets sports science staff has done such a good job, and Jeremy Hefner and Carlos Mendoza having a feel for how to handle these guys. They've done such a good job with this staff, especially those 2 pitchers, that they are pitching innings that they haven't seen before or haven't seen in a long time deep into October and giving them good starts. So just credit to those guys and of course, the staff around them.
It's no coincidence when you pour in resources into what, supports the team whether it's the pitching lab, whether it is the sports science, whether it is your training staff, the results will come. And the Mets have an owner that has poured so much financial resources into those things. And it's no surprise that there's not luck. It's not lucky that Luis Severino stayed healthy all year. It's not lucky that Sean Manaea found something he hasn't had in a long time. It's, when you do things the right way, you find yourself getting more luck, Joe.
It's by design. It was by design, and they're reaping the rewards. I'm sure they didn't expect necessarily this, but ultimately they wanted to find a way to keep guys healthy. And, this is going to have impact beyond this season with other free agents and other players. But that is a conversation for another day, because the Mets have 3 more wins to go, and they are in the World Series.
This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. Remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review with a question, and we'll look for it for a future mailbag. And, of course, you can watch the show on SNY's YouTube channel. Become a subscriber over there as well. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.